Huron-Wendat peoples. The PPF operates out of Ottawa, which is unceded Algonquin territory. And I just really encourage everyone to think of the territory they are on and the traditional peoples who continue to live on and care for this land. If you'd like to learn more about whose land you're on, we actually know of a really excellent resource, whoseland.ca, and we'll post it in the chat. I'd really encourage you to check it out if you haven't before. A little bit about the Public Policy Forum. We're an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. We're really driven by our members from all across the country. And the Energy Future Forum is an initiative of the PPF where we aim to address climate change and Canada's energy future at the same time around one table. Last week, we released a report called A Leadership Blueprint for Canada's High-ESG Gas. Again, if you haven't seen it, we'll post a link in the chat. And in that piece, we argued that development of Canada's natural gas, if done responsibly and in tandem with investments in clean and renewable technologies, can be good for the climate as well as our economy and the world. And so that's the sort of thing we're going to explore with the panel today. Speaking of which, let me just introduce the panel. We have first Edward Greenspon, CEO of PPF and a co-author on the report. In his past life as a journalist, Ed was editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, as well as global managing editor at Bloomberg News for energy, environment, and commodities. We also have Kim Henderson, who's another report contributor and a PPF fellow. She is a principal at Sproat Advising and served as the former deputy minister to the premier, cabinet secretary, and head of the public service in British Columbia. And last but certainly not least, we have Mac Van Wielingen. Mac is an investment and management executive, corporate director, entrepreneur, and philanthropist, and a real wealth of knowledge on gas development, I know. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thanks for being here. I'm going to start us off with some questions, but for those in the audience, please go ahead and provide your questions through the Q&A function as we go along. I believe you can submit your own questions as well as upvote other questions you see if you think they're particularly well put. And we'll do our best to get as many of them as possible later in the program. But first, why don't we dive in? I'll start with you, Ed. So the report argued that demand for Canada's natural gas is going to persist for several decades to come, and that providing it is not only an economic opportunity for Canada, but also good for global climate and energy security. I think two pieces of that are pretty intuitive: the economic opportunity for Canada of increasing our exports, and the global energy security part. But the climate part feels like a bit more of a paradox. How can Canada producing more fossil fuels actually be good for the environment?
Well, let me touch on both on two of those, the security aspect as well, just because Chancellor Scholz is in the country now, and it's very unusual for a German chancellor to make a visit to Canada that's not appended to, a trip to the United Nations or trip to Washington or the G7 being in Canada or something like that, particularly for 3 days. And I think this speaks to the importance of Canada and how it's seen in the energy world right now. So one of the things that Chancellor Scholz has been saying is that, for him, Canada is the new Russia, except it's democratic, except it's reliable, except it's a good trading partner that is not playing geopolitical games. And to your point, it also has very clean gas. It has extraordinarily clean gas in comparison to the world. Now, gas is a fossil fuel, and obviously it carries emissions, and gas, like oil, needs to be decarbonized. But nature has sort of put us a little bit ahead. Nature and ingenuity put us a little bit ahead of the curve of other countries on that, because the gas comes out of the ground cleaner, less carbon intensive. Any LNG tends to be powered by hydropower, so it's a cleaner process, which makes the LNG Canada plant that's supposed to come on, the International Energy Agency has said, will be 60% less carbon intensive than the average in the world, and future plants from Canada will be 90% less intensive. that's the point. And so if we develop more Canadian gas that's cleaner, we will be competing and pushing out of the market gas from places that isn't as clean, or maybe even better, we'll be pushing coal out of the market, which is really amazingly on the uprise in the world. So that's the counterintuitive nature of this in a way. We produce more gas. The world wants this gas, and this is good for global emissions. May not be so good for Canadian emissions, but up in the atmosphere, it's global emissions that count most.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go to Mac then for a minute, because Canada's gas is essentially landlocked today. So we're talking about the potential for exports, but the first LNG export facility isn't expected to come online for another 2 or 3 years. And development of further ones would take longer beyond that. A decade ago, by the way, we were in the same position as the United States. Both of us had a standing start, but since then, they've developed a huge number of facilities and have become the largest exporter in the world. So how did we fall so far behind on LNG, and what can we do to turn that around in the coming years?
David, I will speak to your question, but if I could, firstly, I just want to say that I think that the report that you've just published and that you've distributed was excellent. A lot of clarity, a lot of depth, very coherent, and so it'll just be so interesting to see what all the responses are to it. Now, with respect to the question, how did we get so far behind on LNG? I think most people probably in responding to that would point to regulatory burden, regulatory inefficiencies, delays, and also related to that, activist obstructionism has certainly been a factor. And as you get into more depth, some people would also say, business people and investors would say, we lost a lot of credibility on so many energy infrastructure projects in Canada, where the project proponents had to absorb massive losses. And some of those projects got turned away right at the last moment. And so there's a whole host of factors that could be viewed as being a bit more practical in a sense and regulatory related. But underneath that, one perspective I'd like to offer is that I think is intriguing is the similarities between Canada and Germany, quite frankly. And that both countries were preoccupied with one singular outcome, one essential outcome. And I'm not in any way saying it's not important, but it's carbon emissions, and the reduction of carbon emissions became the be all and end all as to how they were going to measure themselves. And in the report, there's a reference to us having an internal report card that we use. And the problem with that internal report card is, as Ed said, emissions are in the global atmosphere, but they're being monitored within political jurisdictions. And that creates a distortion or dysfunction in decision making, where you become potentially so preoccupied with that one essential outcome that you become somewhat blind to other essential aspirations for the people whom you represent, and notably energy security, but also reliability and affordability. And so I think that we have suffered from that. So we have all the regulatory burden, but we also have, and in the report, it refers to a certain ambivalence at the federal level about projects. And I've sat through a lot of those discussions, and I think ambivalence is accurate, but it's also leaning towards the kind side of our national policy leaders and elected officials as to how they view LNG, because they simply don't want to put emissions on our books. And where it leads you to is to see the reality that to a certain extent, we're not focused on reducing global emissions. we're actually focused on just reducing emissions that are being reported on our own internal scorecards.
Interesting, yeah. Well, Kim, so you worked at the, near the head of a government that was dealing with exactly these issues. I was struck by, some of the Prime Minister's comments over the last few days with the German Chancellor in town. Also, just a couple of weeks ago, Minister Freeland in St. John, New Brunswick at one point said, it's a political responsibility for us as a country to support our allies with energy security. So there's clearly a feeling of urgency in the federal government around these issues. They are thinking about how they can help and they want to help, but at the same time, notably lacking from those conversations is anything specifically about gas, which seems to have the potential to play a real role here. So why do you think that is, and what makes it so difficult for the government to talk about this file?
I think there's three things, and leading up to the crisis in Europe in February, which I think has really heightened Canadians' attention to energy security issues. But I think the three things that concern government is obviously politics. I think that there is and has been a very strong environmental climate lobby that has had good access in Ottawa and in British Columbia. Very, very organized in terms of third-party research and the effort that they've put behind a lot of their work that has been, for the most part, anti-fossil fuel and really not distinguishing between oil and gas. And I think that the different opportunity that we talk about in the report that gas has, or they just don't agree that there is a role for decarbonized gas in Canada. And I think that that's just been a very, very effective lobby. I think part of politics is the read that the parties have on the Canadian electorate and what that means for their voting base. We talked a little bit, I hope we get a chance to reference, David, the summit that we held back in March, because I think that was such an important component of how this report came together. But elections are times where parties try to drive wedges on policies. And we saw some research that talks about during election periods that voters have heightened sensitivity around climate issues because those wedges are being drawn. And, I think the conversation we had is that Canadians might be more of one mind on this than we give them credit for. And I think Canadians are generally ambitious on climate. And what we've tried to do in the report is make three cogent arguments on how we can appeal to Canadian values on gas. And that is the environmental story that gas has to tell about, a decarbonized future with gas, the Indigenous story, which we've really tried to feature strongly in the report because I think it's such an important aspect for gas. And of course, the economic story and how important that is for Canadian prosperity. I think we have the attention of Canadian voters right now because of the security issues in Europe. And so I think it's the opportunity now to really try and strike a chord with Canadians on what I think are those three core values. I think the second is Paris. And so Mac touched on this. Canada understandably wants to make progress on its targets and its pledges and be seen to be a world player in Paris. But I think we touched on this quite a bit more in the report that I worked on with PPF last fall, and I'll never forgive Ed for the name of it because it's so hard to say, but climatativeness. But we talked quite a bit more about the Paris Agreement and what that means as Canada's role as an exporter. And we are penalized in the accounting under Paris and being an exporter. And as Mac put, the world needs more Canada. We produce amongst the most low carbon goods on the planet, and the world needs more Canada, but the accounting doesn't recognize our role as an exporter and penalizes us for it. So I think we'll talk a little bit more when we get to the solution side, because in the former report and in the current one, we talk about how we think Canada has really missed an opportunity to date to really lean in and make a strategic mark as an exporter on how we can make what's called Article 6 of that Paris Agreement work for us as an exporter and how we can get credit for our low carbon commodities. And then the third thing I would say is a process thing, which is how difficult it is to get anything done on the land base in Canada right now. And the one example I'll give is hydrogen. We talk about this in the report, but we talk to lots of folks who say, yes, Canada has a hydrogen strategy. It's very general, very high level, not very well funded when it came out, in comparison to other jurisdictions that we looked at, like Australia and Chile and the US. We consult, and it is the responsibility of governments to consult, but I think Canadians elect their governments to make decisions and to chart a course. And instead, on hydrogen, we have 16, I think, working groups that toil away and have been for a couple of years or more. And we seem unable to actually get to the decision point and chart a course and focus on what's most important, which is how we're going to move it, how we're going to store it. And we need to start to get focused on what's most important. And I hope some of the comments I saw from the Prime Minister yesterday is, I think, again, this attention of the security crisis in Europe will help bring some attention to what's needed to be done, but it's unfortunate it took this to bring this kind of needed attention, because we should have been able to figure it out before this.
Yeah, David, if I could just jump in on a couple of these points for a moment. I'm sure we'll come back to Article 6 and the paradox that occurs if Germany needs LNG and if Canada wants to provide it, that it counts against Canada, not Germany. And Paris contemplated that, but it hasn't been put into practice well enough. But I also just want to say that in fairness to the government of Canada, from my point of view, in the first of these energy blueprints, and there's meant to be 4 of them. The gas one is the second one. There's meant to be one on electrification, one on hydrogen as we go down the road. In the first one, we talked about there being 2 narratives that are competing with each other still in the public mindset. One we called an accelerated phase-out narrative, which is kind of what Germany did. It sort of says, we're going to suppress certain supplies before we're absolutely sure that replacement supplies are up to the job, or the demand is really truly going to diminish. So we're sort of bringing down supply before demand, which is dangerous. And the other model that we talked about, we called aggressive decarbonization, which said, look, we're going to have to go down 2 tracks at the same time. One track is a renewables track, a hydrogen track, the new energy track, and it's a very exciting track for the world, and particularly in light of climate change. The other track says that, but at the same time, oil and gas have a contribution to make, will continue to make their contribution, and will be around in 2050. So we need to have policies to aggressively decarbonize at the same time. And to its credit, the government of Canada is doing that. It has brought in a tax credit for carbon capture and storage. It has supported that. It has, taken other measures of that sort. So it doesn't speak loudly to this, but there are some actions there that are important, because you really do have to have policy on both tracks simultaneously.
I just want to go back to this Article 6 discussion for a minute, because all of you have mentioned it, but I don't know that it's something that's commonly understood or thought about. So as you've mentioned, Canada producing more gas, selling it to another country where it reduces global emissions by being a more efficient energy source, still increases Canada's emissions. And so this traps policymakers and sort of the whole country in this paradox, in this cycle. And in the report, there were some pretty ambitious ideas about how Canada could react to that, including creating some bilateral agreements with countries to share those emissions more fairly, or just Canada going on its own. Can you talk a little bit about those potential solutions, and then what you think they would indicate for Canada if we went down that path, or what needs to happen in the federal government to push us in that direction?
Yeah, well, let me start on the multilateral part, and perhaps Kim, who's done a lot of work, and a lot of work on the report comes from her around bilateral solutions. I might ask her if she can weigh in on that. Multilaterally, this is a part of Paris that just isn't complete, and it should be complete. And as I said a few minutes ago, you could imagine you know, it's sort of strange, more than passing strange, that Canada, which has long been a resources storehouse to the world, as it exports, that this would count against Canada and only against Canada. It doesn't completely make sense if we're helping other people's economies at the same time. So there's been some calculations done for the federal government that show that if I remember the numbers right, perhaps Kim will, because it was in the previous report, something like 45% of our carbon footprint comes from exports, and something like 32% of our comes from import. So we do import carbon into Canada and we do export carbon out of Canada, but the differential is 13 percentage points, which is about, I think, 200, no, not 200 megatons. I'll have to do the arithmetic in my head of 13%, da, 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 da. Okay, about 120 megatons, I believe that would be. So if Germany needs our LNG, or if Asia needs our gas or our oil or anything else, you know, why should it count wholly against Canada? So what we suggested is that let's get, you know, back into negotiations about this. Let's bring a coalition of countries together, as we have, for instance, in grain and other forms of trade negotiations over the years that see that together. We also cited what I think would be a nuclear option, something that Canada would not do lightly, but has done historically before, which is just say, you know, the international system isn't representing our interests, and we're just going to decide to go our own way. And that's what happened in the Law of the Sea negotiations about foreign fishing and maintaining what became the 200-mile economic zone, which was a Canadian invention against our allies, against Britain and the United States and other maritime powers who didn't want that sort of thing. But we said we need that in order to protect our fishery. And thus Canada said, we're not going to take world court jurisdiction and we're going to unilaterally impose that. And then the rest of the world followed. So that was Canada being a leader. I'm not suggesting we have to go there. I think that we want to negotiate, and I think Kim can talk about the potential for bilateral agreements as well.
Yeah, in that climativeness report, we put together a proposal for what a bilateral agreement would mean, but maybe just to step back and say Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the rule book continues to be written. And obviously it's one of the most contentious areas of the Paris rule book to put together. Some progress was made in Glasgow, but I still think it would be viewed as inoperable at this stage. But there's nothing stopping countries from doing pilots. And there is an international agency that tracks pilot agreements, and there's more than a dozen underway. And I think Switzerland did 2 in the last couple of years, where countries can make their own agreements at a national level. It can't be done by subnational governments, but at a national level, you can make an agreement with another country. And I think it, to Ed's point on Canadian leadership on this, as one of the world's major exporters, I think it would be smart for us to try to get some pilots underway so that we can demonstrate what a rule book might look like and how exporters and importers might be able to work together. I mean, in Paris, it's called an ITMO. And what you're trying to do is figure out if there's some kind of transfer agreement from the country who is importing the low carbon product from Canada, who gets the GHG benefit and therefore counts against their own targets, and Canada, who takes the hit in terms of the emissions from the production on our side. And so we had an idea for a bilateral agreement with Japan in the climativeness report, and that is that Japan is interested in Canadian LNG, and specifically from LNG Canada. You have Japanese companies who are investors in LNG Canada, so there's another angle of support from Japan. So is there some way? I mean, I think the challenge is figuring out, why would Japan give up the emissions benefit of the import of Canadian LNG? And I think we talked about in that report, well, maybe they would invest in emissions reductions technologies here in Canada so that the product that they continue to import continues to reduce their emissions profile in Japan. So that was one idea. I know some of the folks that we worked with on this report have got some great ideas around what some kind of agreement might look like with China, because as we know, China may not be as concerned as Canada about doing the math the way Paris says the math needs to be done. So there may be opportunities with China, but I just think it's we have, very, very skilled trade negotiators in Canada who have done remarkable work on major trade agreements in the last several years. Like, let's stick that brain power onto what some of these bilateral agreements might look like.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to say, consistently struck by the amount of energy and attention that gets devoted to what is ultimately a sort of accounting issue. Like, this is a global problem. We care about global solutions. But as you say, I mean, speaking of trade negotiators, the amount of effort that needs to go into sorting these things seems totally counterproductive. Sorry, Mac, were you going to jump in there?
Well, I was just thinking the exact same thing. I mean, it just looks out of proportion to the substance of the problem that we're all trying to solve, which is to reduce global emissions. But we can't do what's right in terms of solving that problem because of accounting issues. And who gets credit for what, just on our books from an accounting point of view, even though we're reducing emissions in our global atmosphere. And there's got to be some real meaning in trying to understand why we've been so stalemated in all of those discussions, and that they've just gone nowhere. And with respect to Canada, I have to admit that I'm on the side of just being pretty skeptical as to whether Canada's negotiators and whether Canada's national leaders and policy leaders, or political leaders anyway, are really committed to try to resolve this. I mean, my view and I really appreciated, Kim, the background you just offered there, and also the report itself, which talked about these alternatives, including the moving unilaterally. I have to admit, I'll just confess it to everybody, that originally, as we got into this, my view was, let's move unilaterally and then negotiate as we're doing it to try to create, to change the logjam and to show more inventiveness and initiative around resolving the problems and improving our environment. Instead, we got stuck in a sort of a bureaucratic quagmire, and it's been very disappointing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mac, let me ask you about a bit of a different question. So one thing I hear a lot when we talk about gas development, particularly from environmental groups who are skeptical of it, is the idea that gas use in a net zero world in the future will have to be less. So when we talk about gas development today, really what we're talking about is, there will be several years for a project to come online. Then the investor needs maybe 20 years to get their return. And by the time you get to the end of that life cycle, we're not going to need that gas anymore, that it's essentially going to be a stranded asset. Can you just respond to that argument? Do you think there's merit there, or how do you think about it differently?
Well, I'm in the investment management business, and I would ask suggest that we should leave that issue, the stranded asset issue, to those who are really taking the risk. And if we're developing a resource and the world no longer needs that resource, those who put the capital in to develop the resource are at risk. It's kind of like another absurdity that environmental activists are saying, no, we can't do it because that resource development won't be needed and there'll be a stranded asset. I mean, we'll all make that assessment ourselves, the providers of capital, including the banks. And so, we are a mixed economy, and we need to, in a sense, respect and honor the knowledge and expertise of risk takers throughout our economy. So the stranded asset thing, it doesn't really hold any water for me. I think it's a good issue to raise, but it shouldn't be a deal stopper in itself. And then your other points about, David, about how robust natural gas demand is expected to be going forward. And you can use all the many different institutional forecasts. And it really does look like there's 2 to 3 decades anyway of robust demand levels, growing, leveling off. And then when it levels off, it takes years to roll over. I mean, that's kind of the way the demand curve looks. And in that period where there is demand, don't we want global consumers to be using the most environmentally and ESG friendly products? I mean, and this question I'm asking was worded very, very well in the report. And it's it should be a very confronting question, but it's not the first time it's been asked, as everybody knows. There almost seems to be an indifference among policy leaders and political leaders to whether supplies in fact are ESG friendly around the world. There's a strange indifference. And I've asked many people about it and talked to many people. And the only thing that kind of comes back to is this point we're all talking about the Paris Accord and jurisdictional reporting. And then the point that Kim actually touched on as well, and that is the fracturing of the electoral base and the power of the activist interests in the voice within that base. I mean, those are the points that people keep raising, but it's disturbing. And I know I've gone on and on here, but I, for one, I am incredibly disturbed about what's happening in Europe. And maybe it's because I've got deep European roots, as Ed knows, in the Netherlands, and to a certain extent in Germany. And I just find it incredible that decision makers were so reckless with in a sense, the sovereignty and the control and the freedom of their countries. And I just think we need to keep asking that kind of question, like why, what's behind it, what can we do differently?
Well, reckless is one adjective, and an adjective that I think is not in any way misplaced. If you look at the two, giant mistakes that Germany and Europe made, which was one to rely on too heavily on renewables too early, and without having a backup plan, without managing risk, the risk that their population is now subjected to, and the other, of course, is relying on one of the highest, I don't want to say highest ESG companies, one of the worst ESG countries around Russia for their gas. I mean, to Mac's point, Canada and Germany should have been having this conversation 10, 15 years ago, and did at various points, but it didn't go far enough because neither was sufficiently motivated. And Germany was the vulnerable one, so it really should have been sufficiently motivated. I just want to comment on one other thing, because there's and Max raised this, and there's another report that was out last week as well by the International Institute of Sustainable Development, which is very credible, knowledgeable organization. Their basic argument, makes them market players. It's an argument that really is an argument should be between buyers and sellers, and not part of policymakers, which is that the market isn't going to be open long enough. And Kim would have heard that argument in the mid 2010s, I'm sure, in British Columbia. So it supposes that this market is only going to be open for 2 to 4 years because Germany says its get off Russia gas plan will be complete by then. Well, 2 years ago, Germany, didn't see a problem coming. And if there's one thing, and I haven't been around oil and gas as much as some people in this room, but I have, as a journalist, been around it a fair bit, and you never get it right. You never get it right. Nobody predicts the 2014 price collapse. Nobody produces the 1986 price collapse. Nobody predicts, that Russia will invade Ukraine and throw the energy and food markets in the world into disarray. So if there's one thing it's that you're going to get it wrong. And so you better have insurance policies. You better have backup plans. And I wouldn't, I think the Germans are, I'm sure, coming up with a great plan, but that great plan includes LNG import facilities. So that's part of their plan.
Actually, and I really appreciate your emphasis on insurance or backup strategies, given that we may be wrong. And I appreciate it because the risks of being wrong are so severe, because energy is so important for in everyday life for all people of the world. So we can't really tolerate, in a sense, taking huge risks in not just security, but even affordability. We can see some of the implications of that working their way through the system as well. And then reliability with blackouts occurring in a lot of different jurisdictions. Those are really big risks to take. And ultimately, and I know this hasn't been raised in your report, but it's implicit. Ultimately, the credibility of leadership is at stake. The credibility of leadership in the whole decarbonization movement is at stake. And I think we all have an interest in it. And it's concerning that's the case. Like, we're going to see over the next 2 to 3 years that there's going to be a real backsliding, and it's already happening. And everything's going to start to look differently, and it's going to be harder to extract commitments from countries because of that backsliding, and the moral suasion is going to be less influential. And so it's the credibility here is, the loss of credibility is worrisome, and that's why we really need to have these kind of conversations and the reports that you've prepared at PPF to step up everybody's awareness and knowledge so that we can make the best decisions.
I think that's an important point, Mac, that climate action doesn't happen without public support, and public support requires that people are still able to pay their bills as we go along the journey.
And public support over 3 decades.
Yeah.
So you've got to sustain public support, and you can't surprise and disappoint people and make it look as if they're paying a price that they don't have to expect, that they don't expect to pay. That will, if you actually really believe in climate action, if you really believe that we have destiny with 2050 to save the planet, then you need to make sure that what I was describing as insurance policies, risk management, going down both tracks, that you're doing that very well, because otherwise you're flirting with a danger that's not your normal danger. It truly is an existential danger.
Yeah.
So let me bring in Kim on an aspect of this, because one of the things I heard from both Mac and Ed there is that in terms of this stranded asset question, let that be a risk that the market takes on. So the private sector isn't asking for government subsidy here, but rather for other kinds of support. So can you talk a bit about that? What is the industry looking for from government in order to expand this industry?
Well, I think in part there's a simple answer to that question, and that is a commitment to gas as part of Canada's future. I mean, we talked a little bit about this at the summit, and maybe just for a moment I'll describe what that event was. When we started this work about a year ago, we heard quite plainly that too many of these efforts are industry looking at each other across the table and talking amongst themselves, and not often enough does this industry and many industries in Canada really proactively reach out to different groups and want to hear their perspective and include that in their thinking and think more proactively. I kind of refer to it as doing government's work for them. The more that consensus can be built among diverse stakeholders, and that's presented to government, then you've done their work for them and kind of cut off the need for extensive consultation processes. So that was a really clear directive in the very beginning on this work. And PPF hosted, I think, a really important summit in March in Toronto with, I think, up to 90 diverse stakeholders, and we were really pleased to have Minister Wilkinson and Premier Horgan there, who participated virtually. But we had the investment community, which I'm going to come back to, government officials, industry officials, think tanks, involved a few speakers from Europe and from the International Energy Agency. So really thoughtful, provoking discussion over the course of the day, which really helped enrich this report, and I think was really important. But Mac, there was a sobering moment, I think, at the end, and one of the investment banker guys who left the conference at some point and then came back and had told us a story of he had to leave because he had got this urgent call around this concern about where Canada was at, and the concern that what was the future for Canadian gas. And I think the discussion we had was at its core, how do we assure investors that there's a future for gas in Canada, and therefore they're willing to put in the capital that's going to be required to fund the transition. This will be a technology transition. This is about R&D, and it's not necessarily asking the Canadian government to do that R&D. Industry's better positioned for that, but they need the strong signal that the government sees a future for Canadian gas. So I think that's what's at its core. But I'm interested in Mac's thoughts on that.
Yeah, Kim, I really appreciate that. And what came to mind as you're speaking, well, firstly, I was sympathetic with that investment banker. But what came to mind was the quote actually in your report about the top Norwegian energy official. And I'm just going to read it. I had it in front of me. Has bluntly stated, our plan basically is to make sure that the Norwegian continental shelf has the last drops, the last molecules, the last barrels to survive in that competition. And the competition he's referring to is the carbon, environment, ESG, economic competition to be a supplier in energy markets. And then, as Ed knows, there's a number of us who've been in Canada who've been trying to talk that way. And that's this whole expression, Ed, of the last barrel, and the last barrel should be the best barrel, and the best barrel should be Canada's barrel. And for what it's worth, I argue that all the time in Ottawa, to everybody, and the reason is that it offers a pathway forward. It's a vision. And the vision is to be the best, and including on carbon. Ultimately, doesn't mean literally to be the best, but from my perspective, any market we enter, there should be no harm. Our products should never cause harm. And then you can kind of quantify what that is. Like for carbon, for example, well, we always want to be 10% or 20% below the average carbon emissions in the supply stream going into that market. And so Canada's products will do no harm. And we are doing better, and we're doing well for the world. I mean, those kind of perspectives would change everything, in my opinion. And it would change strategies, it would change vision, and it would lessen all the tension between suppliers and government.
one of the things also that the report argues is that Canada's success itself in bringing down emissions so far has largely been based on switching from coal to gas in our electricity generation. So Ontario moved on this very early. Alberta has been moving on this over the last half dozen years and much more quickly than anybody would have expected. There's other provinces now where the federal government is putting pressure on them to get out of coal. In the United States, the market did this. Because of the discoveries of gas, a lot of utilities that were burning coal saw that there was gas was plentiful, and they switched over to gas with remarkable, results in terms of bringing down emissions. So, even in the Trump administration, despite getting out of Paris, despite the antagonism to this, actually their emissions were plummeting. So we sort of wonder, why don't we make this a international program of Canada's, and maybe in partnership with the United States, coal to gas switching? Let's help China. Let's help other Asian countries. Let's help actually Germany now, which is refiring up shut-in coal plants, for goodness sakes. So that should be an explicit effort. It doesn't mean that gas is going to be the last fuel that's burned. It means that the less coal, which is going up in the world, not down, going up, the less coal and the more gas, that's a tried and true formula. Look at Alberta and Ontario.
Yeah, that's right. So you can find like really good examples, like real world examples, where that phenomenon, that trade in a sense, in the mix, in your energy mix, allowed for a dramatic reduction of emissions. And the United States is a fantastic example. And they weren't even in the Paris Accord. Yeah, as you point out. And so I think it's noteworthy, but would Canada be prepared to show that kind of leadership? I mean, as a Canadian, that's the kind of leadership I'd like to see us show. And partly because, I mean, to speak bluntly, we all feel so close to our European friends and allies, but do we want to follow Germany? I mean, at this point, in terms of their decision making and their policies and their strategies, I'm not sure. I'm not sure anymore.
Let me ask a little bit, or let me probe a little bit deeper on this coal question. There's a comment I like in the chat, or a question saying, I feel this report should be called Reducing Global Coal Plants, which maybe would have been a good alternative title. Although I think the report talks about gas doing more than just that, but that's a major piece of it. One image which really struck me from the report is a chart showing the growth of coal in China. And as Ed and Mackie both just talked about, we've seen the impact that replacing coal with gas can have in terms of reducing emissions. But exactly to that point, I think the federal government has been on the same page to an extent and has said, we're willing to support the export of gas to China to the extent that you can prove that it's displacing coal. But I think what we've heard from industry is that that's a deceptively difficult thing to do. So I guess my question to anyone is that realistic? And if so, how would you go about it?
Well, I've heard that said by respective ministers. Like if you can bring in an agreement, like an offset, some sort of an agreement where, emission, where it's guaranteed that the natural gas would be used to reduce emissions from coal plants. And quite frankly, it feels like part of that ambivalence we were talking about later. And it even feels like a touch of obstructionism, because as you point out in the report, natural gas is fungible. I mean, it trades all over the world. As long as we know our natural gas is among the best going into the market, I think that should be sufficient. Otherwise, I think we're just creating roadblocks for ourselves. But you're right, David, and I really appreciate you asking the question, because it's a sore spot for a lot of people who've been trying to advocate for Canadian natural gas. I don't know, Kim, how you feel about that particular point.
Yeah, I agree with what you have to say, Mac, and certainly, we know that question continues to come up. I'm afraid I don't have it in front of me, but we have a citation in the report where, Fortis has been part of commissioning some research to actually prove that on the displacement of coal in China, and we have some statistics around that in the report. And if more research is required to prove some of these points out, then I think we should do it. If this is some kind of stumbling block for the government in terms of moving forward.
Well, Ed, I want to get to more questions in the chat, but there's one part of the report that I feel we haven't explored enough yet, which is this idea you mentioned before of a two-track strategy to Canadian policy, that we can and should invest in natural gas, but that can't, and by that I mean invest both time and money and energy, but that can't come at the expense of also dedicating ourselves to developing clean and renewable technologies. Can you talk a little bit about that, like what that two-track strategy looks like, and how do we ensure that investing our efforts in gas doesn't come at the expense of investing in solar, wind, carbon capture, batteries, all these other technologies that we're going to need? Oh, you're just on mute there, Ed.
I apologize for that being on mute. I thought that was a 2021 thing I had gotten over. David, I think that there's the greater risk, first of all, that we have out here is of underinvestment, not overinvestment. If we overinvest in this transition, that will be because we're trying to play it safe and make sure that the things that are happening now in Europe aren't going to happen elsewhere in the world. So, and by those things, we are talking about, people perhaps, definitely having to turn down their thermostat during the winter, maybe having, real problems with home heating. We are talking about already in industry, in the last few weeks, there's two major smelters in Europe, a zinc smelter and aluminum smelter that are shutting down because gas prices and gas availability is just too challenging for them. And lots of people are going to lose their jobs, and materials that go into things like EVs aren't going to be available. And in fact, what's going to happen, or what at least the analysts say is going to happen, is that those materials will be replaced by materials from Russia and China, which will emit 3 times as much as they do when produced in Europe. So these are the kind of strange things that we're allowing to happen. So if we happen to overinvest in decarbonization and in new renewables and technologies, so be it. We have as I said before, I think most everybody in the world believes that there is an existential threat to posed by climate change, and an existential threat might mean that we're going to spend a bit inefficiently to get a resilient system that can respond to everything. So both tracks are absolutely necessary, because both of them are going to be producing energy over the next 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah, and I'd add, I think those are great points. And, one point I would add is that I think renewables will actually make greater inroads if there's truly reliable, dispatchable backup energy there now. And so, that would be natural gas. And if it's clean, the cleanest natural gas arguably in the world, why not use natural gas to meet your peak demand and create that assurance within the public, that is there, and that reliability will take place, albeit using natural gas, and while renewables continue to build up, because it's going to take a very long time. It's going to take decades, and right now we don't really have a backup strategy. As you were pointing out, Ed, that Germany never did anyway either, but they just carried on. And so that's, I wanted to make that point about renewables. And then the other point I just would reemphasize as well that Ed was referencing, and that is the risk is actually underinvestment. It's not overinvestment. And you're seeing that in all, in the International Energy Agency's work and everybody who's looking at investment levels. And if I recall the numbers correctly, we were running at about 650 billion last year of so-called clean energy. And there's a number of groups that are pointing to the need for 4 to 5 trillion a year by 2030 and sustained after that. And so we're way below what's needed.
Can I ask about another, I mean, speaking of that idea of these two streams of investment dovetailing somewhat, another space where that's really true is hydrogen, like we spoke about earlier. Now, I'll confess, and maybe others can correct me, that sometimes the bullishness on hydrogen seems to be a little bit overstated. I mean, there's sometimes some grand claims out there about how all gas infrastructure will just be easily transitioned to hydrogen. And that feels overly ambitious to me. On the other hand, as you pointed out earlier, Kim, the federal government sees the opportunity there, which I think is commonly accepted now around hydrogen, particularly in things like transport, heavy industry, and recognized that 2 years ago, released a strategy, and not a lot has happened since. And meanwhile, we've just had the IRA passed south of the border that is promising huge investment in hydrogen and could make it pretty hard to attract the sort of ingenuity we need here in Canada. So I'm wondering if anyone has comments about that, how natural gas development can dovetail with the development of a hydrogen industry here in Canada as well.
I think the two can fit very well together for decades. I mean, hydrogen is it's fantastic, but there's so much that has to happen to really build up that sector within the economy, and it will take many years, if not decades. And initially, it will really be in specialized markets, and you mentioned some of them, such as heavy trucking, and then also natural gas with carbon capture it can be a very, very important part of building up the hydrogen business in a way that's affordable as compared to the 100% green hydrogen strategies. And so we need to be practical. But one of the things that I would just put out there that I feel when I have these conversations with people is a lot of times what's missing are time frames. That is, that we're not realistic. It has changed, like going back 2 or 3 years ago. I kept bumping into people, including people within government, who thought we could do all this in 10 years. Well, those people are kind of gone. In the same way that the climate deniers are kind of gone, there's still some of that. And there still are some people out there who say we can do this really, really quickly. But we're all getting a lot more realistic. And that's really positive. And we can have conversations about implementation risks now and get into depth. Whereas a few years ago, I couldn't because people thought I was just resisting. And that's all changed. Now people really want to get into, well, how are we going to do this? So I'll just stop there, David.
Yeah, I might add to that, David, just to say that one of the good conversations we had was about just really getting on with it. People say don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and I mentioned earlier, I think we just do too much consultation on these things instead of just trying to actually make decisions and move and test. I think BC has a good strategy on hydrogen, and they launched an organization back in March that's going to try and figure out what some of the main projects should be. But we've got a bunch of provinces going off on their own and coming up with their own hydrogen strategies in the absence of something that the federal government is trying to knit together for the country. And in contrast, we looked at the Australia hydrogen strategy, very, very detailed when they rolled it out, and they're just getting going. And so it may not be perfect, but they're going to test it out. And so, we talked about they're putting out RFPs and they're trying to figure out, how are we going to produce it? How are we going to move it? And they're trying it out as public-private partnerships, but there's all different models, and they're just trying stuff. And I think sometimes in Canada, we're a little bit risk averse at doing that, but we really need to. And I think there's a bit of a theme in this conversation too, that, so many of these things require long-term thinking, and that's really hard for governments who think in terms of electoral cycles, and in particular, the windows you have before you're preparing for the next election, when you get things done. And so it's admittedly hard stuff to be thinking and mapping things out long-term, but I really liked Australia's approach. Let's just try a bunch of stuff and see what sticks and see what works.
Yeah, and when it comes to hydrogen, David, I think that if I were a proponent of LNG with a window that will last, certainly into 2050, if not beyond, but I'd be looking as much as possible to be able to redeploy as much of that plant into hydrogen if that worked. I think one of the regrettable things that's happened around the current visit is that we've turned hydrogen back into a coloring book, and we've pitted different forms. And I think the public is familiar now with the term green hydrogen, which is hydrogen from electricity, essentially. Blue hydrogen from natural gas, but there's other forms. There's turquoise hydrogen, which is has a lot of promise. What the United States has done, in contrast, in the new bill that's gone through Congress and been signed by President Biden, is they've been platform neutral, platform agnostic. What they are doing is supporting hydrogen, and what they want is hydrogen that emits as little carbon as possible. So low emitting carbon. The process, the platform from which that comes, they're agnostic about. Right. The important thing is as few emissions as possible. And I think Canada, that is the approach Canada should be taking. We want to move towards hydrogen. If hydrogen is going to be feasible over time, we certainly want to explore it aggressively, as Kim is saying. But let the engineers duke it out for who has the best hydrogen, and it might be different people have better hydrogen for different uses or different markets.
Yeah, it's a really important point, Ed. What should matter is the carbon content, not the color.
There's a question here in the chat, which is a bit technical, but kind of essential, I think, which is simply, is Canada's LNG materially cleaner, I guess on a global scale, once scope 3 and downstream emissions are taken into account? I think that's talked about in the report, but does anyone want to just explain for a minute the thinking there?
Yeah, I also saw, David, in the chat, some folks asking for a reference on the emissions profile of Canadian gas versus that of other producers in the world. So we'll give a shout out to the Business Council of British Columbia, some work that I was involved in with them a few years ago, and it was all done collaboratively with BC government officials, was to do a third-party verified report on the emissions profile of BC's natural resources relative to its competitors. And so that report, I think we have a citation on it in our report, but it's called the BC Low Carbon Advantage. And you can link through to the report that was facilitated by MNP Accounting. So yes, including scope 3 emissions, when we were looking at exports to Asia, the BC LNG has a significant advantage over its competitors. And that's just product on product, right? Comparing BC LNG to US LNG, that doesn't count the displacement potential if you're displacing coal. One thing I would say about, because I know some folks have asked in the chat about kind of international comparisons. International comparisons can be really difficult because you may not have veracity in the data and even availability in the data. And I know when we did that work a few years ago with the Business Council that, we would have loved to have compared the emissions profile of Canadian gas to Russian gas, but there's just no data that you can really believe in to put those kind of analyses together.
And David, I just say on behalf of PPF that, we sought that kind of data and we couldn't find it, publicly available in a single source. But what we also saw was that when the International Energy Agency did a special report on Canada that it published in January, and I believe it was the first time they'd done a special report in Canada in nearly a decade. And what they said in their report was that the next generation of plants, I said this earlier in the session, but that the current LNG Canada is 60% better than the global average in terms of its carbon emissions, 60% less carbon intensive than the global average, and that the next generation plants, which will have more electricity in their production, will be 90% better than the global average. So obviously the IEA has some sort of base numbers that they can compare, and those do validate the idea that Canada's gas is cleaner when it goes into an export market. And while it may not be perfect, clearly there's emissions and Scope 3 emissions involved. It's better than any of the alternatives. So we may as well, to Mac's point about, with the last barrel being the cleanest barrel and the cleanest barrel being the Canadian barrel, it's not just good for Canada, it's good for the world.
Maybe I just add too, like, I think it's intuitive to some extent that Canadian gas is going to be cleaner than sources from, Russia, Qatar, places like that. When you think about the regulations on our gas production, and then the hydroelectricity in BC that is powering the liquefaction of this gas, and then the shorter transport route from BC to Japan, as opposed to from the Gulf Coast and down to the Panama Canal and up, like, it's actually quite intuitive as well that Canadian gas is going to end up being lower emissions than a lot of the alternatives. Maybe another question from the chat, which I think is an interesting one to dig into, is around the role of gas for peaker plants. So we've spoken a lot about gas as an export, but the report does also talk about the role of gas domestically. And gas plays a role, in our electricity system, supporting electricity generation, as well as complementing the electricity system through natural gas distribution. So does anyone want to speak a little bit to the future of natural gas in Canada, and particularly, as with this question, in the electricity grid?
Well, the one point I'll make is that has surprised me is how hard we're pushing for 100% emission-free electricity. And because the only way that we could really do that, and given peak demand days, would be to, in a sense, overbuild the renewable side, or the non-emitting power supply side, dramatically overbuild it in order, and also to really invest heavily in storage, which doesn't look ready yet. But you have to build so much capacity to be able to meet those peak days. Whereas on the other hand, you could, and I referenced this earlier, you could basically use natural gas for that purpose, and it looks incredibly logical. But what I worry about is that last 1% that we're trying to extract out of our power sector. Now we're already at what somebody probably knows, 82%.
There's a lot of variation between provinces, I think.
Yeah, there is, and but Alberta is really coming along now. And so we have one of the greenest electricity systems in the world, and it's extraordinary. But to now push our electricity producers that hard in short time frames, and I think we're all aware, and many of us would be aware, and people listening, that the Clean Electricity Act that has been announced has felt very challenging for some electricity producers. And they're arguing that they don't think they can meet the targets. And partly because of the federal government's own permitting process is so onerous, and the timeframes are so long. And then on top of it all, just to throw a little controversy in here, there's the provisions within the Bill C-69 of the criminalization directed towards those who are corporations and decision makers who can't meet the targets. And so, I mean, I've literally had power producers say to me, you know, like, does this mean that we're going to go to jail? And I know it sounds crazy, but it's an issue, and I'm hearing it more and more.
David, I just add on electrification. You know, as I mentioned before, and as you know, because you're leading it. You know, there is electrification will be the third, third leg in this four-legged process of blueprints and looking at it. And there's, you know, a huge challenge in electricity, in that we're stimulating demand with EVs, with many other things, as we should, to move things towards electricity. But we, you know, don't have the supply, and we don't have the efficiency in place. And, you know, there's some people who think we'll need, you know, perhaps up to twice the supply of electricity than we have now. Certainly, you know, more than 1.5 times the supply of electricity. So, you know, think about that in terms of, you know, building a system over more than 100 years, and we're going to have to, like, you know, replicate an entire new system to have enough electricity. So I would just be careful to make sure that we're switching things over in a way that makes sense. You know, you know, we're using the electricity we have available to displace as much emission as we can, rather than solving things that are not yet, you know, real problems, perhaps like gas home heating, where you would need a tremendous amount of electricity to take it over. You know, this is an issue even for hydrogen. I mean, you know, do we want to use electricity for electrolysis to create green hydrogen? Well, you know, we have to have some big master plan of how much electricity are we going to have, and where do we want to apply the new electricity, the incremental amounts first, and what do we want to leave for later, because it's not going to happen, you know, in short order. Nobody, you know, even if people like wind, they don't like it near their, I'm in a cottage here at the moment, and people don't like it near their cottages, and people don't like transmission lines. And so everything takes a long time to get done, if it gets done. And we need to, you know, shorten those lengths of time. I think the Prime Minister spoke about that himself yesterday in terms of moving gas. That if there is demand, we would have to expedite the regulatory and permitting, et cetera, processes. But even more so, even in a grander way, we have to figure out, you know, where's the electricity coming, where's it going? There's producers of gas in northern British Columbia and First Nations communities that are, begging for more transmission to get electricity for them, and we haven't satisfied that demand yet.
And another question in the chat here is around, you know, in the report, we make the argument that Canadian gas is high ESG, as we call it. The question here is around, what are the areas for continuous improvement to make sure that Canada continues to be a high performer on ESG? So are there particular things that come to mind? They suggest things like board and workforce diversity and inclusion, worker protections, data and disclosure. Are there particular measures that come to anyone's minds for places where Canada still has work to do on the ESG front? Nothing top of mind.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think, you know, most of us immediately start thinking about fugitive emissions, and we've made a real commitment, and the industry's made a real commitment to tackle that issue. Issues around worker safety, for sure. I mean, it's just continuous improvement, you know, funny enough, I take a very broad view of ESG, and when I think the areas where we need improvement, it's not corporate governance. It's not the G within corporations necessarily. It's actually the G within our government systems. And so that would relate to regulatory, what I often think of as just regulatory excellence and predictability, which has enormous value for society to have that level of predictability and assurance. And so I would flag that, David, as a real sort of big issue. And we've already touched on it a number of times. I haven't focused on it very specifically here. But it's the governance of government relating to energy.
I'll just build on that, David, for a second to say that, the late great business guru, Michael Porter, used to say that demanding customers make for better companies and demanding supply chains make for better companies. And I think that's true. And we have a great example of this in Canada that occurred several years ago when the then Gas Metropolitain, now Énergir, was buying gas from Alberta, and they insisted on higher ESG standards, and those ESG standards extended to gender equity and to issues beyond the E as well. And God knows there's a lot of work to be done to bring more social justice and economic reconciliation vis-a-vis Indigenous participation, which I guess is an S subject and maybe a G subject in the ESG world. So yeah, there's lots of room for continuous improvement, and there's lots of room for people to put pressure on. I mean, the government of Canada has put pressure on Canadian producers vis-a-vis methane emissions, fugitive leaks, et cetera, of methane. And Canada has a much, much better record than the United States, for instance, because it has to rise to that standard. So there's all kinds of, and I should add, and this is something I learned from Mac 2 or 3 years ago, who sent me a regulatory decision from the state of Washington for an LNG plant in the state that and the regulatory authority there approved this based on the gas coming from Canada, because it was so much cleaner than the gas that would come from the United States. So that was a condition of approval for the regulator in the United States. So yes, there's improvement, and there's a whole bunch of ways to create pressure points to have that improvement. But of course, it has to be realizable. You can't ask for something, you can't sort of ask for electrification and refuse to provide transmission lines. That doesn't work.
Well, we're coming up on time here, so I want to ask just a final question, if I can, and maybe I'll start with you, Kim, around how you hope that in the next, let's say, 5 years, the conversation or the industry will have changed in Canada. I mean, I think the goal of this report is to affect the dialogue around these issues. They're very tumultuous right now with the energy crisis in Europe, and I think policy is changing really quickly. So when you do that projection forward to 5 years in the future, where do you hope that Canada's gas industry is at?
Yeah, I think it builds on what Ed talked about in terms of the energy blueprint that PPF put out. I mean, I think we need to have more honest conversations with Canadians around what our energy transition looks like, and to have multiple scenarios, and as we talked about, insurance, and insurance for our own domestic supply, but also for supply for the world. There's a few things that I think need to get done in order for Canada to be successful. We talked about, a broad commitment to the future of gas and the role it will play in Canada's energy transition and how we get to 2050. But I think we need to rapidly accelerate on hydrogen. And again, I hope that some of the announcements being made this week are important in that regard. But to Ed's point, it needs to be color neutral and be concerned about the emissions profile at the end of the day. And I think we need better coordination on electrification. We certainly saw signs in our consultations over the last year that there is not good coordination right now between the provinces and the federal government on electrification and where those investments need to be made. I think we need a lot more coordination on that. We heard loud and clear at this summit how essential Indigenous participation is to this story. And what more can be done to increase that participation and equity stake in the future of Canadian gas. And one of the key things that was talked about was access to capital for First Nations and loan guarantees. So I think there's a lot of First Nations groups that have a ton of experience now in British Columbia and in Alberta, and we had East Coast examples too. This is not a British Columbia issue. Where we really need to increase the equity stakes and participations of Indigenous communities as a really essential component of the future of gas. And I think that there's more that can be done on that front. We already covered the bilateral trade agreements as being important. And Matt touched on this as well, the regulatory processes. It takes too long to get things done in Canada, and it needn't mean that you've got a reduction in your standards because Canada has a good record on its standards, but the processes involved are taking too long. And I'm enthused by the Prime Minister's comments yesterday that because of the need of Germany, that somehow we might be able to move a bit more quickly here. And get through our processes, regulatory and permitting processes in an expedited way. And I hope that's the case. And I think we need to look at that across the natural resource sector in Canada, because I think the natural resource sector is essential to the future Canadian prosperity.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kim. And maybe just one point on that, because this popped up in the chat at one point as well. We did, as we mentioned, an important part of the report is talking about the Indigenous story for gas development. And we did hope to have an Indigenous leader join us today, and just through some technical difficulties at the last minute couldn't. So we haven't focused on that as much in this conversation, but it is such an important part of the overall picture. But how about you, Ed? Where do you hope to see the industry in 5 years? Oh, Ed, did you hear me? I went to you.
I'm sorry, I thought you'd gone to Mac. My apologies. What I hope to see is that, as long as gas is in demand, that Canada will choose to be in that gas game, that will work out this Article 6 issues, whether bilaterally or otherwise, so there's a fair distribution, so that we don't create the perverse disincentive to producing gas that will be good for the world, although it may add to our totals. That doesn't make any sense. I think Kim summed up things really brilliantly, and I'll repeat two of the points, but I'll just repeat them. I hope in 5 years that we'll see even more Indigenous ownership and an economic sovereignty taking place among those First Nations that want to participate in this gas development, which is many, as we've seen. 16 of 20 First Nations along the route of the Coastal Gas Link have now become owners. Have invested in that gas link. We have the tremendously uplifting, encouraging experience of the Haisla Nation, which is building its own, which is in feasibility to build its own LNG export facility in Kitimat. You have the Nisga'a interested in that. You have in Newfoundland interest as well. We had convened one session a while back with a group of Indigenous leaders, and then we published it as a paper because it was what they had to say was so compelling. And one of the main messages is put this at the center of UNDRIP, that nothing, and I am quoting here, nothing speaks to free, prior, and informed consent as required under UNDRIP more than equity ownership. If we are partners, that qualifies for free, prior, and informed consent. So that's something that I think is a matter of social and economic justice, as well as good sense. And finally, if we're going to meet the challenge of climate change, government is going to have to be assertive to get things done, to get the things done that it believes need to be done. And that means that if a government purchases a TMX pipeline and it goes through all the environmental approvals, whether you agree with it or not, but that's where the law has landed at the end of the day, then you can't have municipalities all around, deciding against that they have, a different view of the world. And the same thing with provinces blocking in resources. I mean, we've seen Quebec block in other people's resources for values that it doesn't have, but we've also seen Maine block Quebec's resources, its electricity, from getting to Massachusetts. This is a problem, and within the country, at the very least, when governments say, we want to do this, they're going to have to stand up and make sure it gets done, because we don't have a lot of time to play with.
Thanks, Ed. Mac, anything to add to those visions of the future?
Yeah, Kim used the expression that the natural resource sector is critical to Canada's prosperity. I would add to that sentence. It's critical to Canada's prosperity, and it's critical to the functionality of our nation. And I have to say, I do worry about that. We're not going to go into a discussion about it, but I worry about a lot of the unrest that we're seeing in different ways, both socially and also politically, and the dysfunction of that for Canada as a nation. But in that context, I believe we are incredibly well positioned to be a world-leading, responsible, reliable, innovative energy and resource supplier to the world on all relevant criteria. The carbon, reliability, the whole thing. And that is our opportunity, and it's incredible. And it's an opportunity for Canadians, but it's an opportunity for all of our customers and all of our allies and friends and humanity, for everybody.
Thanks, Mac. Well, there's so much more here to talk about, but we're out of time. We'll be continuing to have these debates at PPF and Energy Future Forum. So if anyone isn't a member and would like to learn more, please reach out anytime. But for now, I'll just thank our audience, our wonderful panelists. Thank you, Kim, Ed, Mac. Again, the report is a leadership blueprint for Canada's high ESG gas. And I think, yep, there's a link in the chat to the report if you'd like to see it, as well as to an op-ed that a few of our authors put together in the Globe sort of summarizes the arguments. If you're here, you're probably already subscribed to the PPF mailing list, but if not, you can find a subscription at our website, ppforum.ca. And that's the best way to stay in the loop on our events and our reports and other opportunities that might come up. And that's it. So thanks again for being here. Thanks to the panelists, and we'll see you again soon.